Thank you, Jerome. And good evening, everyone. I'm very excited about tonight's program. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'm Maureen Blanc, your moderator for this evening, and it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Michael Brune is the executive director of the Sierra Club, America's largest and most effective grassroots environmental organization. Prior to accepting this position in early 2010, he served as the executive director of the Rainforest Action Network, where he worked to secure commitments from America's largest corporations to protect the world's rainforests. Mr. Brune's career began in organizing and campaigning with 4 years at Greenpeace. Mr. Brune is a graduate of Westchester University in Pennsylvania, where he earned dual degrees in economics and finance. Ladies and gentlemen, here to speak about the opportunity and obligation to address the current climate crisis, please welcome Michael Brune.
All right, thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Jerome. And thank you to the World Affairs Council for inviting me here tonight. I feel as though it's my duty to start tonight by giving you a bit of a warning that I will be talking about U.S. climate policy. I'll talk about the global implications of our climate policy. I'll be certain to talk about the consequences of inaction, but I need to warn you that I'm inclined to share some good news with you all. So if this is going to be alarming to you, if this is going to be disturbing, I know it's uncommon. I promise to give you fair warning. You can cover your ears, guard your children. You can walk out of the room, close your eyes, go to a favorite place if you need to. But I will be sharing some good news tonight. I also thought it would be good to start by talking about a little family trip that I just took with my wife and kids. This was what we call a workcation, where we went to tour some of the places that the Sierra Club is fighting really hard to protect in Colorado, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. We had the chance to hike with veterans at Browns Canyon. We met with the Havasupai tribe in Arizona. We had a chance to explore some of the most beautiful places in the country and around the world just in the last couple weeks. And I mention this because it was exhilarating and alarming all at once, all at the same time. After you've seen canyon country in Utah, or after you've spent some time at the Grand Canyon, it's almost physically impossible to walk away and not feel enlightened and enlivened and empowered and inspired. But at the same time, we saw the dark side of our current energy policy. Right as we were driving up to our campsite outside of Canyonlands National Park, we were camping in a state park that's adjacent to the national park. And right outside the borders of the state park, they're fracking for oil. And when we went to bed that night, from our tent, you could see gas flaring. My daughter thought there was another campfire at the other end of the campsite. So you can see gas flaring from the tent of one of the most beautiful places in the world. In the Grand Canyon, we drove south, a couple miles south of the Grand Canyon border, to tour an active uranium mine, where drilling is already taking place right in the watershed of the Havasupai tribe. In Rifle, Colorado, right at the gentle slopes of the western part of the Colorado Rockies, we saw fracking wells. They're fracking for gas there, right next to schools, right next to homes, next to playgrounds, gravel pits right adjacent to the Colorado River. There are 10,000 natural gas wells in Garfield County alone in Colorado, and 20,000 more are being proposed. And so all of this, this is deeply disturbing. It was the weird juxtaposition of some of the most beautiful places in the country along with some of the most disturbing experiences. And so part of the challenge for us is, to see such beauty and to think about what it will take to protect these places. And knowing that people come from all around the world to visit our national parks, to visit our national monuments. And what is it that you think these folks come to see? Do you think they're coming to see drilling rigs? Do you think they're coming to see fracking sites? Do you think they're hoping to see the red rocks of Utah turn brown from tar sands development? Or are they coming to be inspired? The threat of fossil fuels in these places is real. It's imminent. And the promise, the rewards, if we act to permanently protect these treasures, should be obvious. And so, literally the day that we got back from the trip, I flew to Washington, D.C. to meet with the president, and I had the opportunity to join students and other environmental leaders at Georgetown University as the president delivered what could be one of the most important speeches of his presidency. Now, there was a lot that was going on in the news last week, so in case you missed it, the president gave a major speech on climate change. He committed to, for the first time ever, regulate the carbon pollution that's coming from coal-fired power plants. The president committed to double, once again, the amount of energy that we get from the sun and from wind. He's going to be greenlighting enough private investment, both on public lands, but also in public housing, to power more than 6 million homes by 2020. The president agreed to begin the process to develop the next generation of fuel standards for our heavy-duty trucks and buses and vans. These are the big rigs that get between 4 and 6 miles per gallon currently. 4 and 6 miles per gallon. These new regulations could save almost 500,000 barrels of oil every day, which is more than half of what would come from the Keystone pipeline. The president also committed to an end to public financing for most new coal plants overseas, and he committed to refuse to approve the Keystone pipeline if and when it's proven to take us backwards on climate. But what the president said, I think, was even more important. He said, and I quote, "We can't just drill our way out of the energy and climate challenge." And he made a very clear case that we have no choice but to act, and to act fast, unless we're prepared to do what no generation in our country has ever done before, which is to leave the next generation with fewer opportunities than we had ourselves. The president said, and I quote again, "I refuse to condemn your generation and future generations to a planet that's beyond fixing. As a president, as a father, and as an American, I'm here to say we need to act." Now, sometimes when a president gives a speech, that's all that it really is. It's just a speech. And it's something that might get covered that night in the news, but pretty quickly it's forgotten. Other times, a speech can have an impact that can be measured for years. And I believe deeply that the president's speech might be one of those speeches. It has the potential to reverberate through state houses across the country, through city halls, and through corporate America. Just to give an example, right now, across the United States, there are hundreds of utility managers, regulators, and business investors who are making decisions on a weekly basis about whether to invest billions of dollars in pollution controls for old, dirty, outdated coal plants, or to reinvest that money in clean energy instead and replace those coal plants with clean energy. Every week, those decisions are being made. Coal plant after coal plant after coal plant, boiler after boiler, utility after utility, state after state, all across the country. And so one speech indicating the direction of where our country is going, not just to regulate the carbon pollution coming from these coal plants, but where we need to go as a society, can have an impact that goes far beyond a series of bullet points that might have been in that plan. And what I think we need to consider, and consider carefully, is what are our choices as a society? We can either go in the direction that the president has suggested we go, or we continue with our current course. And so I want to just examine that current course a little bit more, because I think collectively around the room, we're beginning to see what our society will look like if we don't take strong action against climate change. Take Hurricane Sandy. This is a storm that hits home personally for me because the house that I grew up in on the Jersey Shore, the house that my dad built with my uncle about 50 years ago, was flooded by the storm. Completely, the first floor was completely gutted. All of the old pictures that my parents had saved, all the old kind of cheesy letters that my dad used to write when they were dating, they were ruined. The furniture, the drywall, all the appliances completely destroyed. And so was the house next to us, and every house on the street next to us, and every town for 3 miles in each direction. I drove there a couple weeks after Halloween last year when my parents were allowed to visit their house for the first time. And I've never before seen destruction for miles and miles and miles and miles. Every house had severe damage. That storm was a wake-up call, $65 billion wake-up call to policymakers in the US that was part of a $110 billion wake-up call. That's the cost of extreme weather events in 2012 alone. 2012 alone, we spent more than $110 billion beginning to recover economically from these extreme weather events. Globally, the total bill was $1.2 trillion per year. But I can cite numbers. You can have anyone cite a bunch of statistics about what it costs to fight climate change. But to try to put this in real terms, let's talk about sea level rise. We were just talking about this earlier with a meeting with students. For sea level rise, we should expect between 200 million and 1 billion people to become climate refugees over the next 4 decades. Most of those people will come from the world's poorest countries. Think about the global instability that will create. And then there's the heat. And I'm talking heat. When we were driving home from the Grand Canyon a couple days ago through the Mojave Desert, the low temperature in Death Valley that day, the low temperature was 107 degrees. That's hot. That's hot. The high temperature was 130 degrees. This is heat that kills. A decade ago, there were tens of thousands of people who died in Europe from just one heat wave alone. Hundreds of people died in Chicago in that same year, in 1 year. And again, most of those people were low-income folks or people who are at the margins of our society economically. Look at the wildfires that are ravaging western US right now. We have 72% of the West in severe drought. We had this tragic accident in Arizona where 19 firefighters, heroes in their communities, were killed. We're seeing as a result of the drought and as a result of the wildfires, cattlemen are finding it more difficult to feed their cattle. Food prices are beginning to soar. Beef prices are setting new records. And diseases. Just a word on diseases. Last week, news broke about a formerly rare brain-eating amoeba. You heard that right. A brain-eating amoeba that is found in freshwater lakes. Right? This is an amoeba that can infect you if you swim in a warm freshwater lake, a warm pond, and you get a few drops of water up your nose. It's almost always fatal. There's no known cure. And as the temperatures are rising, this amoeba is showing up in more and more waterways. I can go on. We can spend the whole night talking about the dangers of climate change. I think it's probably smart that I stop at the brain-eating amoeba part. Right? It's pretty safe we stop there. You know, climate disruption, really, genuinely, as the president said, is the global threat of our time. And the threat, the more you look at it, the more sobering it gets. The more closely you study the problem, the bigger it actually appears. The more you look at the science of climate change, the more grim the picture can become. We are exceeding many of the worst case scenarios, but we're doing so years earlier than we thought. But in the middle of all of this, in the middle of all of this doom and all of this gloom, there's actual signs of real progress, genuine progress that should give us hope. So here comes the warning part about the positive sense. Cover your ears if you can't take it. I understand. It feels good sometimes to understand how bad the problems are in our country. I believe deeply that we are seeing hints, these fleeting pictures of what the world will look like when we create a clean energy revolution. And with a little bit of luck and with a whole lot of hard work, with some clear-eyed thinking and with some tough politics, we can actually meet the challenge. All around the world, contrary to what you've heard, we're beginning to respond with an energy revolution that will transform this planet. We are. We are beginning to respond with an energy revolution that will transform this planet. Let's start in the United States. For decades, the United States has led the world in creating this mess. We have the highest greenhouse gas emissions for years of any country. The cumulative emissions of greenhouse gases in the United States staggers above what any other country has produced. We've been the largest carbon polluter in the world. But today, we're starting to set a different example. As President Obama said in his speech, the United States has succeeded in reducing its greenhouse gas emissions more than any other country. In fact, our greenhouse gas emissions in 2012 were as low as they were 2 decades ago. And the top reason that we're beginning to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions is because we're moving beyond the dirtiest fossil fuel, coal. Coal is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the country. It's the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions around the world. Coal is the largest source of mercury poisoning. Coal contributes to 4 out of the 5 leading causes of death around the world. And the good news is that we're moving beyond coal. We're moving beyond coal at a rapidly increasing pace. And the story of how we're doing it is one that can inspire us to have similar results in other areas. The story actually starts with President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney. Back in 2001, Bush and Cheney proposed to build 150 new coal-fired power plants all across the U.S. And then there were several dozen coal-burning utilities who added more proposals for several dozen coal plants all across the country. And so the Sierra Club began to organize to fight this. And we took on this big challenge of trying to fight about 200 coal plants by focusing on one single coal plant. We didn't have anybody on staff that had ever charged or challenged a coal plant before. We didn't have any volunteers who were experienced at fighting coal plants. But we had 2 people working out of Chicago who took on this singular coal plant. And they pulled the air permits, they began organizing their neighbors, they knocked on doors, they made phone calls, they put together a coalition of health experts, they interviewed doctors about the health impacts of coal, they began to testify, they began to fundraise, they organized, and they won. They defeated the Endec coal plant 50 miles south of Chicago. And then local communities throughout the upper Midwest heard about this victory, and they began to organize themselves. And they put together a regional coalition, dozens of organizations, some big ones like the Sierra Club, lots of small groups who didn't have much funding, didn't have any staff, but had a lot of passion. And they didn't want a big polluting facility in their backyard. They took on several dozen proposals for new coal plants, and they defeated several dozen proposals for new coal plants. That led to a national coalition of organizations, not just the Sierra Club, but Earth Justice, the Environmental Integrity Project, NRDC, Rainforest Action Network, Greenpeace, literally hundreds of organizations, giant ones with big budgets and tiny ones, fence-line community groups that only operated in their own hometown. And together, we defeated coal plants in Florida with the help of Governor Charlie Crist. We defeated more than a dozen coal plants proposals there. We defeated coal plants in Texas in spite of Governor Rick Perry. And together, this relatively ragtag, underfunded, overworked coalition of organizations, today, so far, we've defeated 179 of those proposed coal plants from one end of the country to the other. So that's the good news. The challenging part is that none of that actually succeeded in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. When you think about it, all that did was to stop the rate at which things would have gotten worse. All that did was to prevent coal from being locked in as the dominant source of how power was being produced for the next half century. And so 3 years ago, we started the next phase of this work to identify the oldest, the biggest, the dirtiest coal plants already in operation, and to seek to retire every single one of them all across the country and replace them with clean energy. There's 513 coal plants. There's 1,274 individual boilers at all these coal plants. And our goal is to replace coal as the dominant source of how power is produced in this country and make sure that clean energy, solar and wind, energy efficiency takes its place. So far, since January of 2010, we've secured the retirement of 147 of those coal plants. That's about 1/6 of the existing fleet. There's one big coal plant in Washington. It's going to be retired. There's one big coal plant in the state of Oregon outside of Portland. It's going to be retired. The city of Los Angeles currently gets 40% of their power coming from coal. By a decade from now, that'll be down to 0, and that power will be replaced by clean energy. All across the West, we're retiring these coal plants and beginning to replace them with clean energy. The sun might rise in the east, but clean energy is rising in the west. We're seeing this in Texas, in Kentucky, in Chicago. The 2 coal plants in the south side of Chicago pollute more people than any other coal plants in the country. They were both retired late last year. So all of this should be encouraging, but I bet right now that some of you are saying, yeah, but what about China? How many folks were thinking that? All right, what about India? Okay, so part of what is most encouraging, I think, is that what is happening in the US, we're starting to see in other countries around the world. Yes. Technical moment here. Thank you. All right. Coal-fired power is on its way out, particularly of the developed world. In the European Union, 73 coal plant proposals have been scrapped. In Australia, all 12 of their proposed coal plants have been defeated. And even better, when you look at countries like India and China, more of this coal is being replaced with clean energy than ever before. China, of course, now has the dubious distinction of having replaced the United States as the world leader in carbon pollution. And it's true. We should face facts that China burns a lot of coal. But at the same time, renewable energy investment has outpaced coal investment in China since 2009, and the gap is growing. In 2012, there was more investment in wind alone in China than there was in coal. And when you add solar to the mix, that makes the gap even wider. In India, clean energy is already cheaper than coal plants that use coal that's imported from out of the country. By 2017, at the latest, it'll be cheaper, clean energy will be cheaper than all coal plants. The thing to pay attention to is that none of this was predicted by any international agency, by any market analysts. Nobody analyzing the energy industry has predicted this rate of change. And to give a couple examples, in 2000, the International Energy Agency's estimate for wind power, so 2000, they made estimates for wind power that would be online by 2010. They said by 2010, there would be 34 gigawatts of power that would be installed of wind. The actual level, 7 times higher, 200 gigawatts of power was installed. The World Bank in 1996 estimated that China would have 9 gigawatts of wind power by 2020. By 2010, they were already at 45. World Bank said that by 2020, China would have 500 megawatts of solar that would be installed. Again, by 2010, a decade earlier, they had 900 megawatts, beating their total, but doing it a decade earlier. All around the world, investment in clean energy is outpacing coal and oil and gas investment. It's not just the investment. What's coming online is coming online more quickly. So in 2012, in the United States, we added more new solar capacity and new wind capacity than all of the new coal, the new gas, any nuclear power that would have come online. So we're already transitioning away from fossil fuels by bringing more clean energy online more quickly than dirty power. And so back to the U.S., looking at what this means for U.S. leadership, when we're seeing an accelerating transition for clean energy, I think it's important to talk about both obligations and opportunities. A couple months ago in Washington, D.C., I participated in what I think was a great illustration of both our obligation and our opportunity. I participated in the Sierra Club's first ever peaceful civil disobedience. I risked arrest by handcuffing myself to the White House fence as part of a civil disobedience action to draw President Obama's attention to the climate crisis, to urge him to make this a top priority in his administration, to urge him to develop a climate plan and to say that it's a moral and economic crisis. A couple days later, I joined with 50,000 people at the Washington Monument to participate in the largest climate rally in American history. So when you might think of those two events, you might have a question of who participated. And contrary to what some folks might think, it wasn't just tree huggers at both events. I had the chance, I got hauled off to jail demanding climate action alongside Julian Bond, who is one of the greatest living figures fighting for civil rights in our country, longtime leader of the NAACP. And a few days later, I shared the climate stage with Tom Steyer, San Francisco's own billionaire climate investor who recognizes not just the environmental costs, but the economic risks of climate disruption. Our movement, the movement for a clean energy future, is growing larger and more diverse and stronger because people from so many walks of life are recognizing not just our obligation, but our opportunities to act. Not just that we must act to preserve our planet, but that we can act to better our future and the future of our children. And in reality, before, when I was talking about the growth of clean energy, we're seeing a similar growth in fracking across the U.S. It's unleashing more natural gas and more oil than ever before. And we have a very clear choice in terms of our energy policy in this country. Down one path is to keep doing what we've been doing. We can continue to mine and drill and frack in as many locations as possible, to pull up as many fossil fuels as possible in order to maintain the way in which we're doing things. The other alternative is to try something that would not only keep our economy running, that would not only keep the lights on, but put more people to work and make our air clean and our water clean and our climate more stable. It doesn't seem like a difficult decision. It doesn't seem like it should be all that challenging when we think about it. But we have to, in order for us to make progress, we have to understand clearly who our adversaries are and who our opponents are. And right now, we have the coal and oil and gas industries who have been working overtime to paint a very different picture in our heads. The idea that combating climate change, that fighting climate disruption, means settling for a lesser quality of life. A lesser quality of life. That's right. So this is the folks who brought us the Exxon Valdez disaster and the Deepwater Horizon spill say that clean energy advocates are threatening the quality of life in America. And they say this seriously, right? The folks who brought us coal ash spills and skyrocketing childhood asthma say that clean air and clean water safeguards threaten the American way of life. These are folks, the executives at some of the largest oil companies in the country who are pouring billions of dollars into ads, who are buying political candidates and distorting, polluting the political process, just like they pollute our air and our water and our atmosphere, are saying that betting on clean energy is a bad political choice. So where is our quality of life if we have to worry about contracting a previously rare tropical disease? Where's the quality of our life if our families' homes are threatened by coastal flooding? What kind of thinking tries to make us believe that there's something bad about a future where we breathe increasingly clean air and clean water? And what's so bad about a quality of life that allows us to participate in a democracy that hasn't been corrupted by huge campaign contributions from the fossil fuel lobby? Let me just talk and give you a different example of what it means, of what the world will look like when we transition to clean energy. Consumer Reports last month gave its highest rating ever to the Tesla S. It's the all-electric, luxury sports car that you know you want, even if you don't already have it. And what they said is that it's, quote, brimming with innovation, delivering world-class performance, and it's interwoven throughout with impressive attention to detail. All right, so most of us can't yet afford a Tesla, but I defy anybody here to say that getting behind the wheel of this one is a hardship and represents a decline in the American way of life. How is going from 0 to 60 in 4.5 seconds with no pollution a deterioration of the American way of life? Maybe it's because we've been living in a fossil fuel world for so long that it takes something like Tesla to shock us into believing how better life will actually be without all of this pollution, all the environmental degradation and the health problems that somehow we've learned to accept, that somehow we just shake our heads when we drive to Canyonlands and see drilling rigs on the horizon. But I believe that once we open our eyes and seize the opportunities in front of us, there's no stopping us. We can create a clean energy economy, and we can do it faster than anyone thinks. The U.S. replaced horses with cars, 20 years. The shift from landlines to mobile phones happened in a decade. There's no reason that we can't replace dirty fuels way faster than the glacial and glacier melting pace that the fossil fuel industry PR machine wants us to accept. When my family and I visited national parks and monuments this summer, we saw tourists not just from the United States, but around the world. 30% of the people who visit Grand Canyon come here from outside the country. And they came to see what Ken Burns called America's best idea, the national park system. We have set an example through this national park system for everybody by protecting some of the most beautiful, ecologically and socially and culturally irreplaceable places in the country. Now we have the chance to lead the world with an even better idea, putting fossil fuels behind us and opting for clean energy, clean water, clean air, healthy communities, and job-generating prosperity. What's not to like about that? Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Michael, for those great remarks. And yes, it was very helpful. But we have lots of questions about some of the big problems that are still out there. And I'm going to dive right into fracking. On your workcation, as you were in the Grand Canyon, I believe, and off in the distance seeing a natural gas and fracking operation, how do you rectify that natural gas is a key part of our energy mix, yet fracking is such an environmental disaster? And I have a few other questions which I'll read as well. But while pushing for a significant switch to cleaner energy sources, it's a great long-term goal, but the technology is not ready yet to replace coal and other fossil fuels. So in the short term and in the midterm, shouldn't we focus on switching to cleaner ways of burning and domestically available natural gas? So if you could focus on natural gas for a minute, that would be great.
Sure. Okay, so here's the challenge that we face is we have to get off fossil fuels. And we have to find different ways of powering our society, keeping the lights on, making sure electricity continues to flow, and finding different ways of moving ourselves and goods all across the country. We are heavily dependent on coal and on oil and on natural gas to maintain our economy as it currently is structured. So transitioning off of fossil fuels is a challenging thing to do. There are certain things that are much easier. All of the old and outdated coal plants that I was talking about earlier, these are relatively easily retired over a series of years and replaced with a basket of clean energy choices. That lists of what the alternatives should be should always start with conservation and the efficient use of energy. The best way to meet our energy challenges is to maintain the quality of our life by using less energy. The United States uses energy more inefficiently than almost every other developed country. So there's a potential win there to put more people to work by using energy more effectively and more efficiently. After that, we have abundant clean energy resources that are not even close to being fully exploited. And by that, I'm talking about primarily solar and wind, but also geothermal power. We have more energy that comes from the wind in 6 states in the Midwest to meet our entire electricity needs all across the country. We don't lack for the capacity to utilize clean energy. What we lack for is political will to meet that. As we transition off of oil and use more efficient vehicles or electric vehicles, and as we transition off of coal, gas will play some role in that transition. We won't be able to completely replace every car, every truck, every coal plant with 100% clean energy right away. The right role for policymakers from the Sierra Club's perspective is to first do what I said, to go all in on clean energy and maximize the amount of clean energy that's being installed. So as each coal plant comes offline, at least 50, 60, 70, 80% of it, if not a full 100% of it, should be replaced with clean energy that is used efficiently and is stored so that less fossil fuels will need to be used. For the gas that is being used, because we can't make this transition immediately and completely at every single facility, we have to have much better standards for how it's being produced. Right now, the natural gas industry isn't governed by the Clean Air Act. There are loopholes in the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. In almost every major environmental statute that currently governs other industries, including other fossil fuel industries, fracking enjoys exemptions from. And so the result of that is that there are significant risks being borne to air quality, water quality, and there are also large amounts of methane that are emitting from fracked wells that threatens to narrow, if not completely eliminate, the gap between gas and coal. And so I guess to conclude this, we believe that the gas that is used should be minimized as much as possible and produced as responsibly as possible, but we should be really candid that this is a dirty fossil fuel that poses significant risks. The other question was there was an assumption that the technology is not ready to meet the demand, and I would disagree with the basic assumption there, because I do think that we've seen amazing innovations in both solar and wind over the last few years. The price of solar has dropped by 80% in just the last 3 years. We're seeing companies like Solar City and Sunrun and Sungevity that now make it possible for low-income or medium-income households to install solar on their rooftops with no money down and lower their electricity bills. We're seeing wind be more affordable than ever before. This has led Denmark to get 40% of their power from clean energy. Germany could hit more than 40% within the next couple years. Spain and Portugal will be over 50% in the next couple years. We now have 9 states in the U.S. that get at least 10% of their power just from wind alone. All of these trends are increasing, more clean energy installations at a cheaper price, and so it gives optimism that we actually can create an economy that gets a majority of its power from clean energy in the short-term future.
Thank you. And staying on the clean energy topic, here's a question on nuclear power. How do you feel about nuclear power as a clean energy source, and is it worth the risk?
No, the Sierra Club's opposed to nuclear power. And the way that we look at nuclear power and all energy sources is we subject it to 4 fundamental questions. What's the cleanest, as you might expect, since we're from the Sierra Club? What's the cleanest? what's the cheapest, what's the safest, and what can be brought online most quickly. And when you rank all of the energy choices according to those 4 questions, you find that nuclear power ranks last or almost last in almost every category. When we were, as I was mentioning, when we were outside the Grand Canyon, we toured this uranium mine right in the Grand Canyon watershed, right outside one of the natural wonders of the world. Nuclear power is not clean, and it's also the most expensive form of energy. So why would we neglect or reject investing in wind and solar when it's cleaner, when it's safer? You don't hear about the proliferation of solar weapons. Why would we invest in nuclear power when we know that clean energy would do a much better job?
Sticking with clean energy and clean energy investments, here's a question. Is the rapid growth of the global renewable energy industry economically sustainable? And in the U.S., do you see more federal funding or stimulus coming into the clean energy investment space?
Okay, so I do think that the global surge in clean energy is sustainable primarily because we're reaching economies of scale, both in terms of manufacturing and installation. And so those increasing inventory of clean energy is driving down the cost of clean energy, and it makes it easier for more communities to transition. It's also true that we've achieved grid parity in communities that don't have access to, or many communities that don't have any electricity right now. So there are more than 1 billion people who, in addition to not having clean water, don't have reliable electricity. And it is cheaper in most of those communities for us to bring those communities online using solar and wind than it would be by constructing a big polluting power plant. So I do think that gives hope to this transition being sustained over the long term. I should caution, however, and say that the challenge is massive, because what we need to try to accomplish as a society is 2 things. One is to increase the standard of living for more than 1 billion people who are suffering in abject poverty and who will be using more energy in the coming years and coming decades at the same time that we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the best way to do that is to not follow in the exact same pathway that we've established over the last 100 years. We can recognize that we built our economy, created an enormous amount of prosperity, a life of great convenience for millions of people in the US and in other developed countries utilizing fossil fuels. We don't have to do it the same way that we did over the last century. We can create a better quality of life by transitioning to different fuel sources to meet the same needs.
Switching to transportation, you talked a little bit in your talk about Obama's announcement with large trucks, and you spoke a little bit about Tesla. This question is about car MPG, and the question is, how important is it to reassess how car mile per gallon is measured, especially now that Obama is requiring car manufacturers to produce vehicles with at least 50 miles per gallon in the future?
Well, I think that there's a transparency issue. We should have every consumer should have clear information on how their vehicle that they're considering buying actually performs. And the Obama administration has changed the regulations, I think, to protect consumers so that it's clear how many miles a car can typically go on a gallon of gas. I think a little historical context is important here, since we're in California, to note that the victories that we've been able to earn, which I'll detail in a second, really came from leadership in California. So for those of you who haven't been following this closely, it was Fran Pavley in the state assembly who enacted what became known as the Pavley legislation, which was the first time that greenhouse gases were regulated in the automobile industry, and it led to significant increases in fuel economy statewide. That state piece of legislation was then copied by more than a dozen other states. And each state, it was a fight. Local voters, local activist groups, volunteers, Sierra Club, and many other organizations worked state by state by state by state to encourage their states to meet the new California standard. when in the closing years of the Bush administration, there was an attempt to homogenize those states and to bring the rest of the country up to that same level of standard, basically increasing fuel economy from below 25 miles per gallon to over 35 miles per gallon. And the Bush administration refused to take action, despite the fact that it would reduce our oil dependence, make us more independent, and save consumers money. When Obama was elected, he switched that policy immediately, locked in a new federal standard that brought the whole country up to the standard that California established. Then, in the second part of his first term, he set the next set of standards governing vehicles from 2017 to 2025. We now have a policy in which the average fuel economy will be almost 55 miles per gallon. The average economy will be almost 55 miles per gallon by the middle of the next decade. And so what that will do is that will save 3 million barrels of oil every day. It'll save the average consumer $8,000 over the life of the vehicle, and it will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That one rule signed by the president without any action from Congress will reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the whole economy by 10%. One rule, 10%, and it started here in California.
So sticking with politics for a second, aside from California, the political polarization in Washington, D.C. is a huge factor on climate change legislation. What is the Sierra Club's strategy for overcoming this polarization in D.C., which is, according to this questionnaire, the greatest obstacle to substantial action on climate change?
Well, so the Sierra Club, we are a nonprofit advocacy organization. Another way to say that is that we are coaches, self-appointed pro bono coaches to policymakers across the country, right? And it's not very different from how a coach governs a team or a parent works with their children, in that you have a combination of incentives and disincentives, rewards and consequences for inaction. So the Sierra Club strategy is to support, cultivate, and reward at the ballot box those legislators who show courage and who take action, regardless of what party they're in, and to challenge and expose and vote out of office those folks who don't show leadership on climate and a range of environmental issues. We take this issue very seriously. We do think that dysfunction in Congress in particular, but in a lot of state houses across the country, is holding our country back from making actual progress. And so what we're doing to complement our electoral strategy and using the 2.1 million members of the Sierra Club as a grassroots army, what we're doing in addition to that is addressing the dysfunction in our government head on. We have a case where 90% of people support background checks for gun owners, and yet Congress wasn't able to move forward. And so what we are doing is we will be mobilizing every Sierra Club chapter in every state across the country to strengthen voting rights, not have them be weakened, to have more people who are going to the polls, to challenge campaign finance laws so you're not seeing fossil fuel companies, Koch brothers, and others drowning out average voices by flooding the airwaves with ads, and then working, particularly in the Senate, to change the way the Senate works so that you don't have a tiny, anonymous minority that's able to obstruct any progress on just about any issue in the Senate.
So we have a couple questions on the XL pipeline, of course, and so you were up close and personal with the president last week. He made a statement about if the XL pipeline will damage the environment, he's not for it, although I believe the State Department came out with a report earlier that said they couldn't find that being the case. What do you think his position will be ultimately on the XL pipeline, and will a decision come down in his administration, in his remaining administration?
Yeah, I do think that the president will reject within the next year, perhaps within the next 6 months, the Keystone XL pipeline, and it won't be built. I think that the president is sincere in his commitment to fight climate change, and he sees this as he said, he looks at this as another American citizen, as a president, but as a dad. And he knows that his presidency will be judged in part, but in a significant way, by what he does and doesn't do on climate change. And anybody who takes an objective, I think, realistic look at this issue knows that we shouldn't be expanding production of oil from the tar sands when it's dramatically more carbon intensive than conventional fuels. If we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and if oil, conventional oil, is a big part of that problem, you don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions by increasing production of something that's worse than conventional oil. And I think the president gets that in very basic terms. And after the State Department finalizes its analysis, after it comes up with a different analysis, this one not being written as the last one was by someone who works for the American, or is a member of the American petroleum industry, I think that it'll be really clear that the pipeline is a loser for our climate and should be rejected outright.
Great, thank you. I have a bunch of questions, international questions, but before we go there, I wanted to ask you about fighting greenhouse gas emissions here at home, here in this room, as individuals. Can you talk about energy efficiency as a way to get people who don't consider themselves environmentalists engaged in combating climate change?
Sure. Well, have you ever wanted to save money before? Energy efficiency is something that individual acts of investing in using your energy more wisely rarely will get you on the front page. You're not going to make news about this. You probably won't even get a congratulation from your kids or your spouse or your parents or your grandparents. But it's just smart economics. Most of us like to spend our money wisely. Few of us like to waste things, particularly on something that's not significant. And investments in energy efficiency is a smart thing to do. I think when we think about climate change, the challenge is so big. The idea of changing the way in which our entire economy is powered can be daunting at times, even if you have faith that clean energy is growing quickly. And so it helps to distill the ways in which we can act into a few simple categories. We can act as consumers, and we should, in using energy more efficiently, whether we're renting an apartment or we own our own home or we're living with a bunch of other folks. So the appliances that we might buy, the lighting fixtures that we might buy, there's been a dramatic improvement in technology where you can get the same quality for a lot less energy costs. You can act as consumers in buying more local foods that the transportation costs are a lot less. You can eat a lot less meat, which is highly carbon intensive. We can also act as voters, and should act as voters, and participate actively and aggressively in the electoral process. And then we can act where we work or where we study. Your business or your church or your school, do they have solar panels? Do they have bike racks that people can get to and from where they live without any pollution? There's a lot that we can do that might seem insignificant, but when you add it up, it's dramatic. We can make sure that our institutions are divesting from fossil fuels and investing in clean energy at the same time. So I think that those would be a few things that I'd highlight.
The Sierra Club is a global organization, and from your perspective, has any country done energy policy right so far? And if so, who are they and what can we learn from them?
I think that there are a lot of countries that are making great progress. We have a great example in Germany where they're getting, on sunny days this summer, they have already exceeded 70% of their power coming from the sun. Denmark, 41% of their power is coming from clean energy. Most of that is coming from wind. Spain and Portugal, as I was mentioning earlier, are leaders in clean energy. The United States has made great progress in making our appliances and our buildings more efficient. We don't have any country that has solved this challenge, but we have a lot of countries that are making great progress. One other thing that I'll highlight is that Germany and Denmark, two of the top clean energy producers in Europe, also have the most reliable electricity within Europe. So they're able to, what they're finding is that as they move away from big central stations producing large amounts of power to thousands of tiny stations producing small amounts of wind and solar power, that a more diversified, interconnected grid is actually a lot more reliable than having one facility that could go out at any time.
Thank you. This comes from a student. Can you talk about our relationships that need to be built with other major superpowers? And how effective or efficient are they? And is there any way for the common person to rally behind these?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for asking the question. I had hoped to mention it in my remarks earlier. So one of the things that the president talked about during his climate speech was this partnership between the U.S. and China on hydrofluorocarbons, which are HFCs used in refrigerants and air conditioning, and they're these what's known as climate forcing agents that can be up to 100 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Huge problem for climate destabilization. And so the president announced this partnership with China that in which the two countries bilaterally would reduce their production of HFCs and then seek internationally for binding legislation using existing treaties that already are established, like the Montreal Protocol that was established on ozone-depleting chemicals a couple decades ago. So that type of partnership that is very focused, very specific, has a clear governance system that could make international law binding, I think offers the most hope. We can get very quick, real, short-term results that will have great consequence. I think in addition to that, there's an opportunity in terms of forest protection as well. This is a lot more tricky, but there's an opportunity in places like Indonesia and Brazil, which have massive amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, most of which are not associated with burning fossil fuels, but with deforestation. There's an opportunity to work with indigenous communities to make sure that these forests are being protected using support and perhaps resources from developing countries at the same time. So I think that in the absence of a globally binding comprehensive treaty on greenhouse gas emissions, probably the most enticing opportunities over the next several years will be much more tightly focused, specific partnerships that hopefully can build up to a lot more.
So to follow up to that, are you optimistic that the United States is now going to lean in on climate change and take a lead?
I am cautiously optimistic, and I think that the president's speech and the actions that we've taken give us more moral leeway in order to do that. We have to be able to produce strong results in the U.S. We have to be able to talk from experience about a transition away from fossil fuels before we can have any standing internationally and be wagging our finger and imploring other countries to do the same thing.
We have a specific question about China. And investing in China. And one of the questions here is it true that there has been no temperature increase in the last 10 plus years?
No.
That's what we thought. And having said that, wouldn't our investment in China be much more effective than in any other part in the world in helping them mitigate?
Well, I think that there's a great opportunity for investments to be made in China. It's a little hard to compare one versus the other because greenhouse gas emissions are global, but also the U.S. has such a strong leadership position around the world that when we have a story to tell of hundreds of coal plants coming offline and the quality of our life increasing, or oil use dropping by millions of barrels of oil every day, and the quality of our life increasing, and more people being put to work, and our automobile industry being revived and thriving as a result, that can have repercussions across global policy discussions that are more significant than any marginal increase that we might see in one country. So I do think that there are opportunities for significant reductions in China and India and Brazil and Indonesia, as I mentioned. But I also think that domestically it is important that we get our house in order and that we produce a powerful example, real-world examples for other countries to follow and to build upon in their own way.
Thank you, and I think on that note, we are out of time. This concludes our program for the evening. Thank you for all the great questions. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, please join me in thanking Michael Brune for his excellent talk and discussion.